I ran it past my daughter, and she knew a lot about children's books and age appropriateness. I mean, she told me that the story I'd come up with was completely unsuitable for young children, and it would traumatize them. I mustn't go anywhere near young children with that story. And so I thought, okay, but I'm going to turn this into one for adults.
Welcome to the Edinburgh Book Festival. You've just heard how wonderful it is. You know that already. And thanks to the Hawthornden Literary Retreat for sponsoring this event. I'm Erica Wagner, your chair. Surely I hardly need to introduce Sir Kazuo Ishiguro, but I'm going to do so briefly. He is, at heart, a musician, more on that later, but has also become one of the finest novelists writing in English. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2017. The Swedish Academy honored him for, and I quote, "novels of great emotional force, which uncover the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world." He was knighted in 2019. We'll begin our conversation tonight by discussing his latest novel, Clara and the Sun, longlisted for the Booker Prize this year. Like Never Let Me Go, the book is set in an undetermined future time when the progress of AI means that robots can serve as valued human companions. It begins with Clara, an artificial friend, waiting to be chosen by a customer like a toy in a shop. She is picked by the teenager Josie and purchased by Josie's mother. Poignancy comes from Clara's single-mindedness, her commitment to Josie and her family, although her care and affection will never quite be reciprocated. I've always been drawn to narrators who are outsiders, Ish told me when we talked about the book a little while ago. It's an extraordinary novel, which we'll begin by discussing before moving on to some broader themes. If you are not in our live audience, and I'm so glad to see a live audience here, but if you are on Zoom, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A form as they occur to you. We'll be taking questions from our live audience too, and those will be passed to me. If you are asking live questions, I'd be very grateful if you can keep them brief. We will come to everyone's questions in the last 15 minutes of the event. But now, before we begin, I'm so thrilled to be talking to you, Ish. Let's have another big round of applause for him. This is the first time I will have heard applause from an event.
I hope. No, it's great to see an audience, actually. Even though I have to say, you look slightly weird. You're spaced apart with masks on. It looks a bit like a zombie movie or something. But it looks. It's really fantastic after all these years a year and a half or whatever, to be addressing a real live audience. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being there. We better start.
We better start. So thank you all. I will begin, Ish. I said a little bit about the book, but maybe you can tell us about its origins, how you came to write this story and in this form, perhaps.
Yeah, well, maybe people have heard quite a lot about this book already. It's been out for a little time. But I mean, one of the things I've been telling people about this is that I didn't start off thinking I'm going to write a book about AI, and I didn't really see this as belonging to a tradition of stories about androids or cyborgs or robots. I started off thinking of this as a children's story, and that's how it literally started. I was thinking of a little story, like a tiny story that would accompany illustrations for young children. And the kernel of the story is the same. It's still the same story. It's just that when I came up with this little idea for an illustrated book, bedtime book for like 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and I ran it past my daughter, who was then working in an independent bookstore, Mr. B's in Bath, and she knew a lot about children's books and age appropriateness. I mean, she told me that the story I'd come up with was completely unsuitable for young children, and it would traumatize them. I mustn't go anywhere near young children with that story. And so I thought, okay, but I'm going to turn this into one for adults. And so in a way, you know, the main character, Clara, I mean, she started off probably as some sort of like a stuffed toy or anthropomorphized animal. You know, that would be typical for a children's story. And when it became an adult story with like dystopian undertones, I thought, okay, I mean, I can carry on with this same structure if I made her some kind of an AI creature. And to my surprise and delight, all kinds of doors opened for me when I did that. I realized there were many. I mean, you might think it's a very restrictive thing to do, you know, narrate from the point of view of some kind of robot. Actually, I found it incredibly liberating.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What precisely was liberating about it?
Well, there's so many things really, but I mean, for a start, I mean, if you're narrating from the point of view of a Martian, let us say, you know, that narrator brings the baggage of the kind of the values of Mars, you know, or a refugee, you know, arriving in some foreign land. You know, there's this huge history that would have to be juxtaposed with the world that the person is witnessing. What was unusual and refreshing for me, and a real liberating thing, was the fact that, you know, Clara is a blank slate. I mean, she's literally kind of born, you know, at the beginning of the book, and yet, unlike having a baby or a young child as a narrator, you can blend that naivety and kind of childlike surprise and wonder at the human world that she's experiencing with this kind of exponential ability to learn very, very fast, so that she can very rapidly go through the different stages of being like an adolescent, middle-aged person, and finally like an old person, you know, very quickly. And so I found that very liberating. The fact that what interests somebody like me, a kind of writer like me, is also all the kind of things she gets wrong. Of course, a child, you know, would see things askew and make naive assumptions. But I thought, yeah, this is really interesting. What would some, you know, like an artificially intelligent creature who is pretty intelligent, you know, but, you know, I thought she would come to bizarre conclusions, just from certain things that she saw. You know, she'll add 2 and 2 and make 6, and in her world, she'll just stick with that 6. You know, she'll continue to believe that is the way things are. So that was very appealing to me. There were many other things, but I mean, even at the kind of just egotistical kind of writer's point level, you know, and you'll understand this, Erica, being another one of these writer people. What was really appealing was even the simple thing like her visuals, that literally, you know, how she sees the world. I thought I don't have to report things in the way that you would normally have to through a human pair of eyes. She would see things in all kinds of strange ways, and you know, I thought she could actually go a bit cubist sometimes. You know, she's you know, looking at a face. I mean, she'll see several different versions or different emotional possibilities of that face, all in one go. You know, a bit like, I suppose, the kind of a Zoom screen, except, you know, same pair of eyes from different angles and so on. Sometimes her vision might break down so that people look like just cylinders and cones. You know, this kind of goes back to when I was a boy and I watched this film 2001, A Space Odyssey, and I had this revelation then. Not because this was about AI or anything. This is pure coincidence. There's a sequence towards the end of that Kubrick movie where the astronaut flies off beyond Jupiter, and the screen just turns into kind of abstract cinematic patterns or blobs of color. I mean, it's like a sort of a psychedelic kind of piece of experimental abstract filmmaking. And I remember watching that even as a kind of 15-year-old or 16-year-old, sitting in this big cinema with other people and thinking, oh, this is interesting. You can get that weird and experimental and avant-garde. A mainstream audience can follow you through that, provided the thing has been framed in a context. You know, we all think this is what it looks like if you zoom past Jupiter, you know, in an out of control capsule. And so you can contextualize it. And I noticed since that time, I keep noticing this in all kinds of things, in pieces of music, in like a pop single, you get a really avant-garde piece of, you know, like a passage, you know, just shoved in there. You know, Beatles did this all the time. If it's in context, the audience will come with you. You know, if you just plonk it down in front of people, they think, oh, you know, it's just pretentious, you know, meaningless stuff. You know, and I'd always thought, oh, you can do this in a novel. You can really, really push the envelope, or whatever the expression is, and do really strange things, and the audience will come with you. The readers will come with you if it's in a context. And I thought, well, actually, if I've got an AI narrator, I can do this all the time, and people are going to stay with me. And so, you know, I could do all kinds of strange stuff, you know, that normally people would just dismiss as just kind of weird, experimental nonsense. But you know, I think it's meaningful, and I'm hoping that it was meaningful for me in the context, and I'm hoping that it is for readers as well, you know, to see things in a really strange, distorted way. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me, I must say. I'm curious, though, how you then integrated any thoughts that you had actually about AI as it exists now, as there may be potential for it in the future. I know you've thought a little bit about DeepMind and what is happening with the way that computers are beginning to think and integrate themselves into our lived world and lived experience. How did you incorporate that into your fiction?
Well, I had been quite independently of my fiction writing. I had been quite immersed and interested in questions about AI. I've been going to some meetings and you know, seminars with very intelligent people, much more intelligent than I am, and I was fortunate enough to meet, you know, some key AI people a number of times, you know, for lunch and coffee and things, to hear what was actually going on in that world. However, for the purposes of Clara, my real interest is the human world, not the AI world. I mean, for me, you know, I still have this completely independent, you know, separate interest, and there are things that alarm me about the rapid progress of AI, and the things that really excite me about it. You know, and I think it's one of the big challenges that, you know, face us. I mean, how do we make this something that is useful and great, and not something that is going to destroy our society? But that was, I tried not to have that kind of dominate or even come into my novel too much. For me, it was an opportunity to look at human beings, human society. And in particular, you know, I thought, okay, this robot girl, Clara, she's been invented with the purpose of preventing teenagers from becoming lonely. And so she looks at everything from the point of view of loneliness at the beginning. You know, she looks at human beings. She stares out of the shop window and tries to understand, you know, in what way loneliness influences the way people move around out there. You know, did they cross that road to stop being lonely, or did they do that? And she tends to carry on through the whole novel with that assumption that human beings have this big thing about loneliness and trying to avoid being lonely. And that, as she becomes more experienced, I mean, that turns into questions about love and family and friendship. But it was really, for me, the AI thing for me was a lens through which I could actually look at human beings, human relationships, particularly, you know, what the hell is human love? You know, how does that work? And if you ask it from the point of view of something like that, a creature like that, I thought it was very interesting. So for the purposes of this novel, I mean, you know, it's not the kind of book that you read because you want to find out what the pros and cons are, what the dangers are of AI, what the great possible benefits are of AI. It's essentially a book about us.
And it's a book for me, exactly as you say, it's a book about experience. It's not full of technical detail. It's a lens into which we can explore humanity. And that leads me to move a little bit away from the novel, the specific lineaments of the novel, and towards some broader questions, as I mentioned. To say that you're going to write a novel that's exploring loneliness, that's exploring the nature of love from an outsider's point of view. When you, Ish, are thinking about where you might turn your gaze in finding the subject for your next novel. At first you thought you might write a children's book, then it didn't seem appropriate to take on this subject in the form of a children's book. How do you know, and perhaps how do we know as artists, when we have a subject that is going to endure, both for us as artists, for you as an artist, and then of course for the audience that's going to read with it? How do you know, if you're thinking about what you're going to do next, this is the one I'm going to stick with?
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked me that, because I'll be quite curious to know how you go about it. I mean, I'm curious, you know, if I come across another writer, this is one of the questions I'm really always wanting to ask. I mean, it seems a bit rude to ask them, but I mean, how on earth do they go about choosing their projects? Now, I don't have an answer to that. I mean, and I'm struggling with this right now. I finished this Clara book. I mean, I was working on it, you know, almost right up to publication in some kind of way. And then I've been doing all this kind of publicity stuff. And it's only now that I've started to think about the next book. And so it's very uppermost in my mind. And, you know, I've been writing for years, you know, I've been writing for over 40 years. And yet I still don't have any kind of routine or system. But because I've got so much older now, I'm now 66, I realized that I had to be very careful. I can't afford to waste my time on the wrong project, you know. And so I've got more and more self-conscious about this question about choice, you know. And I suppose I can't help but draw the analogy with sort of dating or marriage or whatever, you know. I mean, should I be going about this, Erica, my choice for my next book? Should I approach it like, you know, one of these kind of online dating agencies where you kind of algorithmically try and match yourself up, your hobbies and your interests and your political views with the right person, you know, potential partner? Or should it be much more like, I suppose, when we were young, you know, that you just kind of drift about and you completely unself-consciously find yourself kind of falling in love or something? I mean, is that the better way to do it? And I realized, thinking back, certainly for my earlier books, it was much more like, you know, the kind of unconscious, you know, you fell in love with the person on the train kind of thing, you know. But I realized that the more I've gone on, the more kind of dating agency like I've become. And now that, you know, I've got this sense of time running out, maybe I can write one more book, two more books, you know. I think I might be getting overly, you know, careful and cautious. You know, I think I've started to, there's a part of me that's kind of detached from my writerly self. And I kind of feel like I'm behaving like the families who are negotiating over an arranged marriage. You know, I'm thinking very self-consciously about, oh, that's likely to work very well. You know, good career prospects there, and comes from a sound sort of nice, respectable. You know, parents are barristers, and all this kind of stuff. I'm kind of thinking in that kind of way all the time, and I think, well, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe, you know, you're closing the door off to kind of weird serendipity, and I know that. You know, a lot of the books I'm really glad to have written. I didn't really choose it that carefully. You know, it kind of, and although you said when you first asked this question, you characterized it rather like, you know, I might have chosen Clara because it was going to be an exploration of human love and loneliness from the point of view of an alien vision or something. I mean, that it never happens like that, as you probably know. You know, you kind of you go for some kind of you go onto a project usually for some stupid reason. You know, completely not nearly as intellectual and impressive as that. You know, you really want to. At the moment, you say, look, I really want to write a novel with lots of motorways in it. You know, I've got these scenes of kind of drizzly English motorways. I want that. You know. I've been trying to do this for ages. I've got this fictional world, and it really resonates with me. You know, of just kind of, you know, really horrible service stations and these bridges that go by, and kind of grey skies and motorways, and I read. Unfortunately, I don't have a story to go with the setting, but I mean, I'm hoping to find one. Yeah, but it's often stupid stuff like that. I mean, once again.
But you don't have, I was just going to say, is you don't, so you have the motorways, but you don't have the story. And I wonder, because for me, I get, if we use the kind of falling in love analogy, I get taken, you know, I feel my gaze is taken towards a person. You know, a character comes to my mind, and I keep thinking about this person. And I think they have potential. Again, in a way, when you meet someone, you think, oh, I could remain interested in this person for long enough to have a relationship with them or to be married with them. So it's interesting that you have this, to me, you have the setting of the motorways. And now do you think about how you find those other elements? Or do you feel they would fall into place perhaps when you started exploring the motorways by beginning to write?
Well, no. I mean, you put your finger on it. I mean, you see, I haven't started this motorway novel, and I haven't done so for about 20 years. You know, I'm just waiting for something. I realize that this is a superficial thing. It's like saying, you know, it's like someone saying, when I get married, I want to marry, you know, somebody with I don't know, somebody with kind of a lot of freckles, you know, something like this. You know, that's what when you realize that can't be the central thing. You know, it'll be nice, you know, if the real person, the real love of your life happened to have freckles, that'd be really great. But you can't go into the whole thing looking just for people with freckles. You know. That will get you nowhere. Although I have to say, I mean, the way our society is divided up, often people do this. You know, you've got to be a Catholic. You know, got to be Jewish. I mean, they do this, but yeah, you see what I mean. I mean, so I know that the setting is it's a superficial thing. I can't get married just because of the setting. Yeah. So I'm waiting. You know, I'm waiting. And in a way, I'm back at square one. You know, the question you asked is still hanging over me. I mean, it's interesting that you think, for you, literally a character might do it. And I know that, I mean, you've been rather obsessed with this real person, historical figure, Washington Roebling, who was the engineer who built the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, because you've written your nonfiction book about him, his biography, and I know no, you're thinking of writing a novel about him, which for me is kind of admirably bonkers, this kind of obsession, this kind of weird obsession with some not entirely obvious subject, but in a way, I think that's what we have to all look for. This kind of almost irrational desire, focusing in on somebody, and for me, it has to be. I have to find perhaps not a person. Unlike you, I don't think I go for a person, but there has to be a kind of a premise, a story, some kind of little kernel of a story for which I feel equally, obsessive. Even though other people will think, well, that's a stupid idea. Why do you want to do that? But I would say no. This tiny little thing I can summarize in 2 sentences, 3 sentences, I can see is pregnant with possibilities, and I've got to unpack it. I'm waiting for that. Ideally, it should go with motorways, but if it doesn't, all right, never mind about the motorways. And so that I think this idea of the premise is quite important for me. I tend not to be so character-centric in general, actually. In fact, this is something else I was going to raise with you, because I mean, amongst other things, you're a creative writing professor. You run a creative writing program in London, and this question about how important is character in plot and character in writing about in writing a novel. I mean, because I've started to veer away from this character-based way of thinking, but so I'm really interested that sometimes you're drawn to a project simply because of the main character.
I think as I get older, for me as a writer, before returning to you, I have come to recognize, and again, it's interesting what you were saying about as we get older and we recognize we have a limited amount of time, or we look at what we've done before and think, well, perhaps this is the kind of writer that I am. And I, without wanting to limit myself, think, yes, this is perhaps the kind of writer that I am, and I indeed, if, I'm thinking now about another person, a fictional person, a historical character completely made up, and I know I'm interested enough in this character. Somehow his life is, even before I've started writing, is unfolding in front of me, and I think there's enough richness in the span of this life that I might get a novel from it. I suppose I wonder, before we move on to character, I'd like to ask you a quick question about process, because it connects to teaching creative writing. Let's say you're going to think harder about the motorway idea or any idea. Does there come a point where your thinking is deepened by actually sitting down and moving the pen across the page?
Oh, definitely.
As opposed to going for walks and having this in your head.
Oh yeah, definitely. When I audition or interview my possible novels. Yeah, and I've done that since my second novel. Well, I audition my narrators, because when I was starting my second novel, I went some way with the wrong narrator. My second novel is narrated by an old man, but actually I spent ages trying to tell the story from the point of view of his grandson. And then I realized that that's the wrong narrator. So I was going to make that mistake again. And so now I don't, never mind the whole project. I mean, I don't, narrators have to go through an interview process. But to answer your question, yeah, I actually write, things out. I mean, I write tons and tons of things, freehand with a pencil or pen. I'm quite uninhibited in that sense. I don't tend to think everything I write is going to be scrutinized and people will look at it. I mean, I just assume I can just experiment with lots of things and then throw it away. And I find that quite liberating. And actually, a novel like Never Let Me Go, that was something like the third attempt to write it in over a 15-year period. You know, it's a subject that well, let's say it's not a subject, it's an idea for a novel that I'd visited twice before, and it was rejected, you know, because I didn't have all the necessary bits. It's only third time round, so that I managed to write it. And so I've got lots of things that I've kind of started in this kind of experimental way, you know, going back to our old analogy that, you know, many people I've dated, and then it's only years later I think, well, actually I might maybe I'll phone that person up again, and we've all changed, and this time it'll work, you know. But no, definitely, I don't think I've tested an idea. As long as the idea seems to have potential, you know, I would like to test it, because I don't know until I start, you know, at least writing in some form, you know, because I think by writing. I can't just sit in an abstract sense and sit there and predict, you know, where things will go. Even after all these years, I don't have the experience to be able to predict, or, you know, what would happen if I chose this instead of that. I mean, you go into it and then you see. So yeah, I mean, auditioning is a very important part. You know, do you do that? Do you audition ideas?
I don't know
by writing things down.
I don't know if I think about it in quite that. Maybe I should think about it in that way and say it that way. I'd feel better rather than saying, oh my God, I got so far with this and then I didn't know what to do with it. I think from now on, I might say, I was just auditioning this character and this idea, and they didn't quite make the cut. So I'll put it on them rather than on me. But, you know, turning to, you know, thinking about, and you talked about your second novel just then, a word that is often applied to your books, an adjective, is haunting. And to me, one of the things that is saying in our kind of literary code is that your books stick with the reader in sometimes a kind of mysterious way. I know I feel that your novels, in different ways and in different layers, live inside me in an enduring way. While I'm reading them, I'm turning the pages. I'm totally immersed. I can't put them down. But then they also remain. And not every novel does that. There are plenty of novels where we're just right in there devouring them, and we put them down and move on to the next. How do we make art endure? How do you address that question? And I wonder if there's some connection there to your background as a musician, which I mentioned.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a really important question. And I think it does have something to do with my, well, I don't want to say I've got a musical background. I haven't, you know, I'm not a very good musician. I have a musical background in the sense that I'm a failed musician. Okay, you know, I was trying to be a musician and then I became a writer, right? So it's a background in that sense. But I started off as a songwriter when I was a teenager. And I think there's a part of me that still thinks like a songwriter. The point of writing a song isn't that you just entertain people for the 3 minutes while the song lasts. The point of a song is that you know, I suppose in a virus-like way, that song has to kind of lodge itself inside people's, not just people's minds, but in their hearts and in their emotions. You know, songs that really work, we carry them with us all our lives. And when things happen to us, or when we feel certain things, or perhaps just when we happen to be in certain places in the world, these songs come back as our soundtrack, and we interact with them again. You know, we all carry with us, each one of us. I mean, everybody in that audience. I mean, I'm sure, you know, we all have this little jukebox in our heads of certain songs that we have picked up over the years, and they stay with us. They're part of us till the end, you know. And I always thought that is what you're trying to do as a songwriter, you know. And there are certain qualities that I could not figure out what these qualities were, but there must be certain things that make some songs do that and other songs just can't do it. And when I became a writer of fiction, I think that remained a really high priority for me. You talk about enduring or longevity. I mean, this is a completely separate question to whether books survive as classics through the ages or something. It's completely different. This is simply at the individual level. When somebody reads your book, after they finish reading it, 3 days later, 3 months later, maybe 30 years later, does it linger in that person's mind? Does it have some sort of, has it taken over? And has it found a tiny corner in that person's life in some kind of way, in their emotions? That songwriter's ambition has always been with me and has been central to me when I'm writing novels. And I've always found it quite curious that when I hear people kind of discussing things at that kind of creative writing level, so much of the attention seems to be on how you hold the reader's attention while they're reading the book. Nobody ever discusses this question of, what happens afterwards. And I always think it's something to do with me. I'm just a bit eccentric about this. And I have to say, I sometimes think maybe I overrate it. Maybe it doesn't matter that much. Maybe what's important is what's happening when the reader is reading the book, and this afterlife of the book isn't nearly as important as I think it is. I mean, that is possible. But nevertheless, I can't help it. That's the way I think. And I keep wondering, and all these years I've been writing novels, I keep thinking, what is it that helps a novel do that? I can't work it out. I've got a few little theories, but they're not very convincing. I can't even figure it out for songs. There's a mysteriousness about the melody that really haunts. And I've tried to think also when you talk about books haunting you. I've asked this question: right, if some books or films or works of art really haunt, well, what does the actual ghost look like? And when I think about novels, it's odd. I mean, there are maybe it's completely different for you. For me, I kind of get little fragments of a novel that I love, that's become part of my consciousness. I just get little fragments and shards from different scenes that somehow come together to be some sort of composite single thing. And it's kind of loaded with emotion and mood, and that's what I get when that's the thing that's the kind of the being that haunts me. I mean, I don't kind of reproduce the whole thing chapter by chapter in my head, year after year, and and it's very important to me, and I know that that's some sort of a little door I can open, and if I chose to, I could either reread the book or think in more detail about the book, but it haunts me in that sense. And I don't know what it is. I mean, maybe you've got some ideas about what makes some books. I have a feeling, possibly, and you can tell me what you think about this. That maybe having something unresolved, deliberately unresolved, in the work, is quite an important aspect of this. Now, of course, if it's too unresolved, then it's just unsatisfactory. But there is some sort of really interesting and profound and beautiful way to have things unresolved, so that the reader continues to participate in some meaningful relationship, and they're invested in some kind of questions or something. But that's a dangerous way to think, because you deliberately write kind of vague books or kind of books that don't add up. I mean, do you, as a reader as well as a writer and as a creative writing professor, have you come across? Do you have some good advice to give me here? Because if I could bottle this, it'll make my life a hell of a lot easier. If I could figure out just tell me 3 things I can do to ensure that my books haunt people.
Right. 1, 2, 3. I suppose for me, something unresolved, or there are books where I know that I can return to them, or if I do return to them, I will see something new in them. I'm in a different place. Again, I think of it the way that you have relationships with people and relationships deepen. So actually, during the pandemic, I reread, because I thought it would be comforting to me. I hadn't reread it in a long time. I reread Ursula Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, which is a book I love very much, and first read when I was about 11. And the character moves in it from being a boy to being an older man, at least an adult. And now, as an adult and someone who is older than the character is at the end of that book, I kind of look through a different window at that character, and there's still enough there, or something different there, that I didn't see when I was 11, when I was 20, when I was 30. So for me, that's something. I think of it as a kind of layering. There have to be enough, layers for me. And that comes to, again, for me, that's often to do with character, as an individual reader, for me, that the people in the book have to be dimensional enough for me to be able to do that. So that, but every reader, like every writer, will be different. And actually, this brings me, because I'm mindful of the time, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to turn to our audience questions. And I'm going to start with a question that I can see on my phone from our virtual audience. I'll then come to the live audience because it's connected. Andy L. says, I return to the remains of the day regularly, despite rarely rereading novels. Each time I pick up on some new nuance or inflection, are there any novels by other authors that you revisit repeatedly, finding something new each time? So this kind of turns to you as a reader.
There are, I suppose almost by definition, favorite books are ones that I return to over and over again. I have the same relationship with certain films as well. There are some films I've seen about 9 times, 10 times. I don't know if it's simply because, going on from your question and what you just said, Erica, for me, I don't know if it's just the confidence of thinking this time round I will discover new inflections, or because I have changed, I've got older or whatever, it's going to look different. I don't think for me, it's not simply this expectation of finding new layers or new meanings or new, even things that I missed the first time round. I think that's a kind of that'd be a bonus, and that'd be interesting. But I think I'm drawn back to these things by something a little bit deeper and more of a compulsion. I just want to be in that world again. There's something I know that reading this book or watching this film is going to put me into some strange place, and for whatever reason, I want to be there. I want to be in that emotional space. I want to be in that world. And I think that's what's pulling me into books that I return to over and over again. The rest of it is very valid, and I think but it's almost something I notice incidentally. I just reread a book called Troubles by J.G. Farrell, which I last read about 30 years ago, and I thought it was wonderful. And there were many things I noticed this time round, that I probably didn't notice the last time. But that's not really why I went back to it. And that's not really why I was delighted that I did go back to it. For some reason, at a certain point in my life, I needed to be back in that little space, and it was very alluring. I wanted those colors. I wanted those emotions. I wanted that world, So yeah, but to answer your question, yes, I mean, I have a number of books like that. And of course, I have the experience that you must have had too, that, you read something that you thought you absolutely loved and it's very disappointing. It's not the experience you had 20 years ago or whatever,
Are there any, because you mentioned that I know how important film is to you, and you just said, there are films you've seen 9 times, or, can you share one of those with us? That's a place.
As you know, Erica, I'm a complete film nut. So I mean, I kind of a long lists of films, but I mean, in different genres. I like French gangster movies. I like westerns. I mean, that film called Once Upon a Time in the West, this big Sergio Leone western. I watched that over and over again. A lot of westerns, actually. I watched them over and over again, and some American screwball comedies. And of course, because of my Japanese background, I mean, some of the great Japanese cinema from the 50s, like Tokyo Story or Seven Samurai. Every time I see those films, I think I remember how old I was the last time I saw it. And it's almost like I'm punctuating my life with the viewings of those films and thinking, oh yes, look how many things have changed since the last time I saw this, and yet here I am again. And so books, films, these things help us mark our journey through life in some kind of way. But this is all different from that question we were asking earlier about why some books haunt. But yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I'd like to turn to our live audience. Once again, thank you so much for being in Edinburgh and listening to us here on our screens. Do we have any, Rose, can you tell me, do we have any live questions at the moment? But so do raise your hand if you do think of something. We'd love you to contribute. But in the meantime, I will turn, while you're still thinking of your question, I will turn to another of my screen questions from Teresa, who asks, do you consider the notion of other, which we find so often in your books, is central to the divisions that seem so rife in society? And do you think that having the other as the narrator of your fiction can help to humanize them?
Well, my narrators don't tend to be, my narrators aren't probably helpful in, they're not particularly helpful in getting people to be more compassionate to say, refugees who are in some terrible plight, as they are in Afghanistan, and trying to get us to all think of them as people who are close to us. I mean, I don't write the kind of books, or my narrators aren't the kind of other in that sense. That when you recognize that it's very important to try and change people who might be potentially thought of as the other to people who are us. I mean. And that's one of the powerful things that I think fiction can do. I'm not sure if my books are particularly good at that. I mean, my narrators tend to be other in the sense that they're often slightly detached from the main society that they're operating in, like say Stevens the butler or Kathy the clone. They're and indeed Clara, this robot girl. They're kind of outsiders who nevertheless have a kind of an intimate, engaged relationship with what's going on. So they're others in that sense. I would hope that my books might offer some suggestions about the way societies divide, and what perhaps even at the individual level. What are the kinds of emotions and attitudes and feelings that create divisions? And conversely, how you might overcome those divisions. And Clara and the Sun, it's full of divisions. It's full of barriers. Primarily between a non-human and the human, but within the human society, between people who've gained a certain kind of privilege because through gene editing and those who haven't. And indeed, it's a society in which that's rapidly dividing into people who have jobs and people who don't. So I think typically my books have often been about, I suppose, that those kinds of divisions in society. But my narrators, I don't think, are necessarily the sort that are helpful in creating empathy for groups in the real world who we need to actually think of more and more as us rather than them, you know.
But that question of the other or the outsider, you know, brings me to something that we touched on a little bit before, which is the question of both character and, crucially, relationships. And in my teaching of creative writing, I often recommend your wonderful Nobel lecture that you gave in 2017, where you talk about the importance of relationships and figuring out, as you say, I'm paraphrasing you, that if you thought really closely about relationships in your book, that character would kind of take care of itself. Can I ask you to elaborate on that a little bit as we come into the home stretch of our event?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great oversimplification. I like to oversimplify things just to be dramatic. It's not quite as simple as saying, yeah, you don't have to worry about characters at all as a writer. But I actually had the kind of a revelatory moment, you know, kind of a eureka moment in my writing life a number of years ago. Because I'd been brought up, I suppose, in the old kind of traditional Eng-lit system of thinking in terms of plot and character when you regard a novel, you know, as being kind of the important sort of strands that you deal with. And as a writer, I used to worry a lot about, you know, making characters interesting or sympathetic. But I did notice, you know, reading other people's work as well as my own, that you could often make a character, an individual character, really colorful and eccentric and, you know, dynamic, and yet they don't touch you. They seem to kind of exist in their own kind of vacuum or something. And this thing occurred to me suddenly one night, you know, literally as I was watching a movie, wondering why I wasn't enjoying it very much. That actually the important thing is not the characters, it's the relationship between the characters, and you can build up a really eccentric, brilliant character as an individual if that character isn't connected to another character in some meaningful, interesting way. He or she isn't worth anything. And so I started from then on to think in terms of relationships and not characters. You know, I started to think in terms of three-dimensional relationships. You know, asking myself, is this relationship, if this kind of mentor prodigy relationship, or parent-child relationship, rivals, or, you know, the enemy who's turned into a friend, these kinds of relationships, you know, is this just a cliche that we've seen over and over again? You know, if you actually put the thing about relationships in books is that they're not very visible. You know, they're kind of below the surface, but they really, really act on us. You know, like it's like the bass line in a song or something. And so you consciously pull out the relationship and ask yourself, is it a very interesting relationship, or is it just the usual thing that you've seen over and over again? Does it actually change and evolve during the course of a story in an interesting way? Does the relationship surprise you, you know, convincingly, which was Ian Forster's definition of a convincing character? You know, a character that surprised you in a convincing way gains a third dimension by doing that. I thought, well, relationships in books have to be able to do that. And I kind of thought, all right, I'm oversimplifying, but I kind of thought, look, if you just think about interesting relationships that evolve and twist and turn and surprise, you don't really have to worry about the characters on either end of that relationship. they just take care of themselves. They're necessarily engaging. And I'll just add this, that I don't think it necessarily has to be a relationship between human characters either. It could be between, say, one character and a community, or one character and an institution, So, yeah, I mean, in fact, we're talking in Edinburgh here. I mean, there's a kind of a tradition of, people coming to some remote part of Scotland and forming some sort of bond with the community there and being kind of welcomed or not welcomed. I mean, like the movie Local Hero or something like this. The important thing is the relationship between one character and a community, or sometimes it's an institution or something. But there has to be that relationship. And I think in a lot of what we talked about today, about how do you get things that haunt you and how do you choose the next project? I mean, this might be a central thing. You look at the relationship that is in this potential book or the book that you've just read. I mean, is it one that haunts? Is it one that is worth spending the next 4 or 5 years of your life working on? And for me, that's it. Just works for me, that way of approaching things. I don't know what you think.
We just have a couple more minutes now, but I do want to. I'm so excited to have a live audience question. So let's hear our question from the audience before we close our event.
Thanks very much, and I apologize that I don't have a great question, but earlier both of you were talking about this problem of how one knows that a given topic, a character, a theme, a setting, what have you, is really the one to which you want to dedicate several years of whatever remains of your life or something of that sort. I was curious about the opposite side of that question, which is how you know or how you realize when you're actually done with a given work. You mentioned, for instance, that you were working on Clara and the Sun up to the final deadline of publication. So how do you know when you're done? And when you are done, what parts of your own work haunt you, or do they haunt you, and in what way? I mean, to extend on the analogy being used before, are they like old lovers then after you finished? Or is it one extended polyamorous family that keeps multiplying? Or, I mean, I'm curious because I think it's an interesting analogy, but I'm just wondering, that sense of completion is something that always certainly evades me, so I was curious about your experience as writers about it. Thanks very much.
Well, I've spoken about this publicly before, so I'm sure I'll be forgiven for saying it again by the individual concerned, but I often think I've finished my book. I've been working on some novel, I'm triumphant, I finished this book. And then I have this wife who has been there from before I was a writer. So when I first started to write short stories, I mean, she's always played this role. She tells me, no, you haven't finished. You've got at least 6 months, 8 months work left to do because this doesn't work and this is a load of rubbish. You can't keep that in there. And so, I'm dejected. I go back and I do more work, and it happens every time. And with Clara, it happened again. In April of the year, I triumphant finished it at last, and she went off somewhere and came back and told me I had months more to do, with kind of piles of notes. And then what happened to me now is I've got this daughter who's a novelist, right? She's published 2 books, Naomi Ishiguro. And I thought, just out of some kind of professional courtesy, I better show her. And of course, she gives me a whole wad of notes as well. So another 2 months. I can't. So yeah, I do have this moment that you're talking about, thinking, it's kind of finished. Everything I wanted to say is here. And then I've got to get past these members of my family. And it's a kind of a weird experience, that last bit. But I suppose, I mean, certainly with my wife, Lorna, I mean, because it happened right at the beginning, when I first started to write, and it keeps happening, I'm kind of ready for this. I accept that this is part of the process. But if it happened to me for the first time, I'm not sure if I'd accept it. But I think it is quite, I mean, in answer to your question, I think it's probably quite a healthy thing, even if you don't have so these difficult members of the family to do this. I mean, it probably is helpful to always take a step back when you think you've finished and try and look at it with kind of quite cruel, severe eyes and say, look, is there something I can do to make it better? Not just the odd passage that could be tidied up or something. Architecturally, is there something that's not quite right? Or even if it's not wrong, you just change something and it could be profoundly better. It's going to make the difference between it being here and there. I think it's always worth doing that. And that idea that, oh, you're finished is a really treacherous one. I think it's a dangerous one for a writer. Erica, I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I do agree with it, but I am also looking at the clock and I am going to be the cruel person now and say we must finish. I wish that we didn't have to finish, but events anyway must come to an end. Alas, because this has been the most wonderful conversation. Ish, thank you so much for your generosity of thought and spirit, for your wonderful work. Thank you so much to the Edinburgh Book Festival, to Hawthornden, and to our audience, both live and virtual. I hope to see you again, either in person or on Zoom. But thank you so much, Ish.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you all of you who came, and thank you all of you who are out there in the virtual audience. Thank you. It's been a real privilege to talk with you.